A catastrophic failure is buried deep beneath the American heartland. A single rupture that could paralyze 8 states at once. Alabama, Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri, and Tennessee. All of them are built on a geologic time bomb that has gone off before, and will go off again. The problem is, nobody can agree on when. The science is a civil war. One camp says the fault is dying. The other says it's quietly loading for a catastrophic release. Both have data to back them up. And in the middle of it all, millions of people live in cities with infrastructure that was never designed to survive what's coming. What would you do if you knew a disaster was coming, but had no idea when? That's the question millions of people in the central U.S. wrestle with every day, whether they know it or not. Let me know in the comments. The numbers are staggering. A single large New Madrid earthquake today is projected to cause over 86,000 casualties, $300 billion in economic losses, widespread destruction that would make a hurricane look manageable. It's the single biggest natural hazard east of the Rocky Mountains. Most people just forget it's there. So many people watch these documentaries and learn something new, but forget the one thing that helps us make more of them. Do not let that be you. If you feel like you're about to learn something important, hit that subscribe button right now. It takes 1 second, and it ensures you won't miss the next warning. Let's begin. This is not a story about California. There is no San Andreas fault line here. No clash of tectonic plates grinding against each other at a visible boundary. The danger in the American Midwest is stranger. It's older. In some ways, it is far more menacing. To understand it, you have to look down. Deep down. Beneath the fertile soil of the Mississippi River Valley, underneath the soybean fields and the quiet river towns, lies a wound in the planet that never healed. A 200-mile-long, 40-mile-wide subterranean scar called the Reelfoot Rift. It formed over 500 million years ago, during the Cambrian period, when the continent we now call North America tried to tear itself apart. It was a failed continental rift. The tears stopped, the wound closed, but the crust remained permanently weakened, fractured, and vulnerable. A hidden seam in the middle of the North American plate. Today, that entire plate is being pushed westward by the constant, immense pressure of the mid-Atlantic ridge. All of that continental stress has to go somewhere. And it finds the path of least resistance. It finds the Reelfoot Rift. The ancient scar running from Illinois to Arkansas is being squeezed, compressed, and twisted by forces it was never meant to withstand. The faults buried inside it are slipping. They are building pressure. And this is where the physics gets terrifying. The Earth's crust in the central United States is different from the West Coast. It's older, colder, denser, and more intact. When an earthquake strikes in California's fractured geology, the seismic energy is absorbed quickly. Like a rock hitting shattered glass, it dissipates over a short distance. But in the Midwest, that same energy hits solid, ancient bedrock, and it rings like a bell. Seismic waves travel up to 20 times further, carrying destructive force across a massive geographic area. An earthquake of magnitude 7.5 in Missouri is not the same as a 7.5 in California. It is an exponentially larger disaster. It is an event that can ring church bells in Boston, crack plaster in Washington, D.C., and be felt by every single person in over a dozen states simultaneously. That is not a theoretical model. It has happened before. The winter of 1811 was brutal. The American frontier was a raw, unforgiving place, and the people living in the small Mississippi River town of New Madrid, Missouri, had no word for what was about to happen to them. They had no scientific framework for geology, no context for seismology. They only had their senses. And at approximately 2:15 and on December 16, 1811, their senses told them the world was ending. A violent, wrenching convulsion of the earth threw people from their beds. The ground roared. Trees snapped in half. The shaking was so severe that frontier settlers, seasoned to hardship, were unable to stand. For 2 minutes that felt like an eternity, the very ground they trusted as solid became a violent, unpredictable sea. This was the first main shock, a magnitude 7. 5 earthquake that erupted from the Cottonwood Grove fault segment in what is now northeastern Arkansas. But it was just the beginning. The shocks kept coming. All through the night and into the next morning, the ground never truly stopped moving. Just 5 hours later, at 7:15 a.m., a massive aftershock of magnitude 7.0 struck. They called it the Dawn Aftershock, another brutal moment of terror for a population already reeling. In Louisville, Kentucky, a dedicated and slightly obsessive naturalist named Jared Brooks began documenting the events. Using a series of crude, homemade pendulums and springs, he meticulously recorded every tremor he could feel. His final count was staggering. Between December 1811 and March 1812, he recorded 1,874 separate earthquake shocks. The ground itself was coming apart. Deep fissures, some hundreds of feet long, tore open across the landscape. The immense shaking put the water-saturated soil of the Mississippi floodplain under unimaginable pressure, triggering a phenomenon known as soil liquefaction. The solid ground momentarily became a fluid. Massive geysers of sand and water shot high into the air, creating what are now called sand blows. These eruptions covered thousands of square miles of farmland with a thick layer of sterile sand and mud, rendering it useless. From the sky today, on LiDAR imaging, you can still see the pale, ghostly scars of these sand blows crisscrossing the landscape. Ancient wounds from a single winter of violence. Perhaps the most surreal horror was reserved for those on the river. The New Orleans, the very first steamboat to ever travel the Mississippi River, was on its maiden voyage. The crew, caught in the chaos, watched as the river itself seemed to wage war on them. Entire riverbanks collapsed into the water. Islands they had moored to for safety simply dissolved and vanished overnight, swallowed by the liquefied soil beneath them. Then came the most legendary event of all. The February 7th, 1812 main shock caused a violent uplift of the Earth's crust along a section of the riverbed known as the Tiptonville Dome. This sudden, vertical thrust of land, rising 5 to 10 meters, acted like a dam. For a period of hours, it literally reversed the flow of the Mississippi River, creating a temporary waterfall and sending a surge of water backward upstream. It was a moment that defied the laws of nature as anyone knew them. Further east, that same February shock caused the land to permanently subside. The ground simply sank, and the waters of the Reelfoot River rushed in to fill the new depression, drowning thousands of acres of cypress forest. A new body of water was born in a single night of tectonic violence. They called it Reelfoot Lake. To this day, the trunks of those ancient cypress trees still stand like sentinels in the shallow water, a permanent monument to the day the earth gave way. The effects were felt across half a continent. In Washington, D.C., President James Madison and his wife Dolly were woken by the shaking. In Boston, church bells reportedly rang on their own. For the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who was trying to unite Native American tribes against American expansion, the timing was poetically brutal. An enormous comet, later called Tecumseh's Comet, had blazed across the sky for months in 1811. He had pointed to it as a sign of the Great Spirit's power. Now, the ground itself was tearing apart. According to historical accounts, he used the quakes as undeniable proof of his divine mission, a tangible sign of the earth's anger at the encroaching settlers. It was a powerful, terrifying tool of persuasion. For a few horrifying months, the central United States was the most seismically active place on the planet. And then, as spring arrived, the great quakes subsided. The roaring stopped, the ground grew still, and for the next 150 years, America forgot. How do you prepare for a threat you can't see, one that operates on a timeline of centuries, not years? If the ground beneath you shook violently an hour ago, you'd be taking action. But what if it was 200 years ago? Does it still count? That's the fundamental paradox of the New Madrid Fault. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments. We read them all. The nation moved on. The survivors of 1812 rebuilt or left. The stories of the great shaking faded into folklore, exaggerated tales told by old-timers. In the absence of a scientific explanation, they were just that, stories. Cities began to grow in the very heart of the seismic zone. Memphis, St. Louis, Paducah, brick-and-mortar buildings rose on ground that had once liquefied. Bridges were built over a river that had once flowed backward. An entire modern civilization, with its intricate network of power lines, gas pipelines, and highways, was laid down directly on top of a dormant, but not dead, monster. The forgetting was almost total. But the Earth keeps its own records. All through the 20th century, small tremors continued to rattle the region. They were mostly minor, ignored by all but the most sensitive seismographs. But they were happening, hundreds of them. A persistent, low-level rumbling that hinted at the deep, unresolved stress in the crust. Then, in the 1970s, one scientist began to listen more closely. Dr. Otto W. Nutley, a brilliant seismologist at St. Louis University, became obsessed with these small quakes. He started a project to systematically map them, using a growing network of instruments to triangulate their exact location and depth. What he found was chilling. The microquakes were not random. They formed a distinct, zigzagging pattern that perfectly outlined the buried faults of the Reelfoot Rift. He had found the monster's footprint. Nutley compiled the data, documenting over 200 earthquakes larger than magnitude 4.0 that had occurred since the major historical events. He then turned his attention back to the 1811-1812 sequence. By studying the vast area over which they were felt and comparing it to modern quakes, he made a shocking calculation. He estimated the original main shocks must have been enormous, with magnitudes well over 8.0. That number landed like a bomb in the scientific community and among public officials. A magnitude 8.0 quake was a civilization-altering event, and Nutley was saying it had happened right here, in the heartland. And his data showed the fault was still active. Pressure is building up all along the fault, he warned in 1979. That's why we're having small earthquakes. Everything points to something big happening in New Madrid. Suddenly, the old folklore was an urgent public safety threat. Nutley's research single-handedly resurrected the New Madrid seismic hazard from historical obscurity. His work spurred the creation of the Central United States Earthquake Consortium, or CUSEC, in 1984, forcing the 8 most threatened states to finally confront their shared vulnerability. Emergency plans were drawn up, building codes were debated, the Great Forgetting was over. Decades later, new science would refine Nutley's work. Dr. Susan Hof, a seismologist at the USGS, took a different approach. Instead of just looking at the felt area, she painstakingly analyzed historical first-hand accounts, diaries, letters, newspaper clippings, to gauge the intensity of the shaking on a human scale. Her work was like historical detective work, piecing together a mosaic of trauma. Based on this more nuanced analysis, she and her colleagues downgraded the estimated magnitudes of the 1811-1812 quakes. Not to something small, but to a more scientifically realistic range of 6.8 to 7.5. Paradoxically, this downgrade made the threat even more real. An 8.0 magnitude quake seemed almost mythical, too large to be plausible. A 7.5? That was a number geologists knew well. It was a terrible, destructive, but very possible event. The kind of event the fault had produced before, and was clearly capable of producing again. The question that consumed the next generation of scientists was no longer if it could happen again, but how soon. And that question has triggered a bitter scientific civil war that leaves millions of people caught in the crossfire of uncertainty. On one side of this fight is Dr. Seth Stein, a respected geophysicist at Northwestern University. His argument is provocative, and for the residents of the 8-state danger zone, deeply comforting. He believes the new Madrid Seismic Zone is dying. Stein and his team focus on GPS data. Around the world, networks of high-precision GPS stations constantly measure the movement of the Earth's crust to the millimeter. On active plate boundaries, like the San Andreas, you can literally watch the land on either side of the fault move past each other, accumulating strain that will eventually be released in an earthquake. But when Stein looked at the GPS data from around the New Madrid zone, he saw nothing, or next to nothing. The rates of surface deformation and strain accumulation were almost zero, far lower than what you'd expect for a fault that is actively loading for a major rupture. His conclusion is a direct challenge to a half-century of seismic hazard assessment if the fault isn't building up stress. It can't release it. He argues the activity we see today, the small, constant tremors, are not the foreshocks to a new catastrophe, but the dying aftershocks of the one that happened 200 years ago. In his view, the NMIS had a burst of activity, and now it's shutting down. He famously calls the threat a disaster deferred, suggesting the hazard is vastly overstated. On the other side is Dr. Arthur Frankel, a senior seismologist at the USCs. He hears Stein's argument, looks at his own data, and comes to a starkly different conclusion. For Frankel and many of his USCs colleagues, the fault is very much alive and dangerous. Frankel counters that you can't compare New Madrid to the San Andreas. They are fundamentally different geologic systems. Intraplate faults, buried deep in the stable interior of a continent, don't behave like plate boundary faults. Strain may not accumulate at the surface in a steady, easily measurable way. Instead, he argues, it can build up deep in the crust, far below where GPs can easily detect it, releasing suddenly and catastrophically after centuries of quiet. His team points to more recent GPS field data that, they argue, does show a significant, ongoing buildup of tectonic strain when analyzed with more sophisticated models. They also point to the undeniable geologic evidence, the Tiptonville Dome and Ridgely Ridge, topographic bulges in the landscape that could only have been created by repeated tectonic uplift over thousands of years. That kind of land deformation doesn't happen if the fault is dead, and most importantly, Frankel reiterates the terrifying physics of the ringing bell. He states it plainly, the New Madrid area has a high hazard, largely because seismic waves travel efficiently through the hard rock of the central and eastern United States. Even if the next big quake is only a 7. 0, its impact will be magnified across hundreds of thousands of square miles. The argument about whether the fault is dying or not might be academically interesting, but from a public safety perspective, it's a dangerous distraction. The potential for devastation remains, regardless of which theory proves correct in the long run. This isn't just an academic debate. The stakes could not be higher. If Stein is right, billions of dollars being spent on seismic retrofitting and preparedness could be wasted on a phantom menace. But if Frankel is right, then ignoring the risk, defunding preparedness, and building non-resilient infrastructure is an act of communal suicide on an unimaginable scale. If you know someone living in Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas, or any of the other states in the hazard zone, they need to see this. Share this video with them. And if this information has been valuable to you, press the like button. It tells the algorithm that this is a story that needs to be heard. For now, the official position of the U.S. government, through the USCs and FEMA, sides with caution. They operate on the assumption that the fault is active and that a major earthquake is a matter of when, not if. And the scenario they have planned for is the stuff of nightmares. In 2008 and 2009, FEMA and the Mid-America Earthquake Center released a series of massive impact studies. They ran a detailed simulation. What would happen if a magnitude 7.7 earthquake were to strike the New Madrid Seismic Zone today? The results are not projections. They are a meticulously calculated blueprint for a national catastrophe. The direct economic losses are projected at $300 billion. The human toll is even more devastating. An estimated 86,000 casualties, including 3,500 fatalities. This number doesn't account for the subsequent deaths from exposure, lack of medical care, or disease that would inevitably follow in the weeks after. The damage to the built environment is almost total. 715,000 damaged buildings across the region. In cities like Memphis, Tennessee, which lies directly inside the zone, a huge portion of the building stock is made of unreinforced brick masonry. These structures are notoriously brittle in an earthquake. They don't bend, they shatter. The simulation shows entire city blocks turning to rubble. The displacement would be on a scale America has never seen. 7.2 million people would be displaced from their homes. 2 million of them would be left completely homeless, seeking emergency shelter in a region where every piece of infrastructure is compromised, and that infrastructure would be crippled. The simulation predicts at least 15 major bridges would be rendered unusable. Think about what that means. The Mississippi River is the lifeblood of the nation's commerce. Paralyzing the bridges that cross it doesn't just trap the local population, it severs the country's supply chain in half. Food, fuel, and medical supplies would stop moving east to west. The economic shockwave would be felt in every state. Then there is the unseen infrastructure. The vast network of pipelines that cross the Isthmus carrying natural gas and oil. A major rupture would likely cause multiple pipeline breaks, leading to catastrophic fires and a nationwide energy crisis. And perhaps the most terrifying number of all, 15. That is the number of U.S. nuclear power reactors located within the broader New Madrid Seismic Zone hazard area. While these plants are built to stringent standards, the FEMA scenario forces an uncomfortable question. Were they built to withstand the unique, far-reaching ground shaking of a ringing bell earthquake? A cascading failure involving even one of these facilities would elevate the disaster to an entirely different plane of existence. This is the scenario that keeps emergency planners awake at night. A disaster so vast and multifaceted, it would overwhelm not just local and state resources, but the entire federal response system. It would be Hurricane Katrina multiplied by 8 states at once, with no warning, and at the worst possible time of year, winter, when the struggle for survival becomes exponentially harder. I know I've asked once, but if you've made it this far into the details, you understand the stakes. This isn't just content, it's critical information. A huge number of people watch our work but never subscribe. Please take 1 second and click that button. It's the single most important way to support this channel and ensure we can keep making deep dives like this. It truly makes a difference. The fault itself does not seem to care about the scientific debate or the FEMA models. It just keeps moving. The slow, inexorable buildup of stress continues deep in the crust, punctuated by moments that remind us it's still there. The ground in the New Madrid zone is never truly quiet. The region experiences several hundred small earthquakes every year. Most are too faint for humans to feel, but they are a constant, humming reminder of the active tectonic processes at work. Seismologists at the USGS monitor swarms of these microquakes, like the ones that struck near Marston, Missouri and Tiptonville, Tennessee, in June of 2026. Quakes of magnitude 1.2 to 2.6, little pops and creaks in the Earth's crust that serve as a form of persistent background strain relief. But is it relieving enough pressure, or is it a sign of something more? And then, sometimes, the reminder is not so subtle. On April 23, 2026, a magnitude 4.0 earthquake struck just west of Cooter, Missouri. A 4.0 is not a disaster. It might knock some items off shelves, rattle windows, and give the local population a serious scare. But it doesn't bring down buildings. Its significance was not in the damage it caused, but in the message it sent. It was a sharp, unambiguous declaration from the fault itself. I am still here. I am still active. Do not forget me. The Cooter quake generated a flurry of local news coverage and a fresh round of discussions among emergency planners. For them, it was a perfect, real-world drill. It reminded people to check their emergency kits, to have a family plan. It was a wake-up call without the devastation. A warning shot. But for the scientists, it was another piece of a puzzle with no easy answer. For Dr. Stein's camp, a 4.0 is just more evidence of the fault's dying gasps, a meaningless tremor in the grand scheme of geologic time. For Dr. Frankel's camp, it's a clear sign that the fault system is active and capable of producing much larger events. It's confirmation that the strain is real A. So we are left in this strange, unsettling limbo, a region of millions of people, vital to the nation's economy, built on a geologic flaw that is either shutting down or winding up for its next big performance. The science is divided, the evidence is ambiguous, and the stakes are measured in lives and billions of dollars. The story of the New Madrid Seismic Zone is not a cautionary tale with a clear moral. It is a story about uncertainty. It's about how we live with a threat that operates on a timescale our minds can barely comprehend. The 500-year recurrence interval that seismologists talk about is a statistical average, not a guarantee. The last major sequence was in 1812. That was over 200 years ago. We could have 3 more centuries of quiet, or the next one could be tomorrow morning. The ground beneath the American heartland looks peaceful, It is flat, fertile, and placid. But we know what lies beneath. An ancient wound, a network of buried faults, under immense pressure. The shaking has stopped for now, but the pressure is still building.